In this lesson, you'll learn how writers are able to pull details from source materials in planning their story. So here's your prompt. Your school newspaper is doing an issue on urban graffiti. Your teacher has asked you to contribute a story that highlights the positive aspects of graffiti or street art. So your text type is narrative. You are writing a story. Your audience is your school or peers, and your purpose is to show the positive side of graffiti or street art. By the end of reading your narrative, as a reader, I need to be able to see some of those positive aspects of graffiti or street art. So what are these source materials that we're pulling details from? Well, you have a couple that you can pull details from. You have the first article we worked with, Not All Graffiti is Vandalism. You have the article that you just recently used for your formative assessment, Is Urban Graffiti a Force of Good or Evil? You can also, however, use the images that we started this unit with when we were thinking about our opinion on whether graffiti is art or vandalism. So those two articles, as well as any of the images, can become your source materials today. So when we think about our source materials, what are we actually using them to inform? Our source materials, when we're being asked to write a narrative, our source materials should inform our choice of characters, conflict, setting, imagery, details, and theme. Those texts and images might not inform your choice of all of these 7 things, but they should at least inform several. So let's look at the rubric for source materials. This is one of the 3 things that you are being graded on in this narrative. In order to receive a meeting standard, you are using the source materials in writing your narrative, your story. As I read through your narrative, it should be clear that you've drawn details, whether those are descriptive details or whether you've found a conflict or a setting within these texts or images. For an exceeding standard, the source materials were used heavily in writing the narrative, and the details that are chosen are used effectively. So not only have you chosen some details from those articles or the images to include in your narrative, but you've really used them effectively or in craftful ways throughout your narrative writing. So today, your goal is to actually plan your narrative, and we're going to have you do that in your composition notebook. So if you want to add planning narrative to your table of contents, that would be great. For me, that's page 8, but for you, that might be another page. So let's start with the backbone of our story. So the backbone of any great story is the characters, the conflict, and the setting. So I'm going to ask for you right now, in your composition notebook on whatever page you chose, to write characters, conflict, and setting. And then I want you to go back through those articles. Go back and look at the images and see if you can come up with characters, conflict, and setting. You might look at some of the conflicts that the authors in the articles discuss, whether graffiti should actually be fined, whether someone's getting a fine for graffiti, whether graffiti is art or vandalism, right? Maybe your character sees both. Or maybe your character is just inspired by street art in some way. And the conflict maybe is something like they're struggling with their own personal art. Setting. The authors in the articles include a lot of different settings, especially cities where street art has really become a powerful part of the city, like London or Buenos Aires. I really encourage you to look back through the articles and see if you can come up with a setting that really matches with your source material. And then characters are really going to be up to you, but it's important that you decide your characters before you really start mapping out all the details of your story. When you think about this story, the thing I want you to remember is that this is a shorter story than the story you wrote at the beginning of the year. This is not going to be an elaborate narrative where you have a really detailed conflict and lots of rising action. This is going to be pretty short. So I want you to remember when you're deciding your conflict, really keep it small, keep it simple. So I'm going to ask for you to pause the video now and to go and to decide your characters, your conflict, and your setting. Make sure that you are using the source materials throughout this work. Okay, once you've decided on your characters, your conflict, and your setting, you need to actually map out your story. And we, at the beginning of the year, gave you a template for this. But when you sit down and you're given a narrative prompt and a text set, you're not going to have a teacher to hand you a template to fill in. So you're going to actually need to create it. So I'm going to ask for you, just on a blank page, to draw our narrative arc. You can choose to write the titles if you want. But here's what you need to include in your planning today. You need an opening scene. You need a moment that starts the conflict. A moment where it's clear the conflict is just kicked off. You need some rising action. It doesn't need to be as detailed as your first narrative that you wrote in language arts. You need some sort of climax, just a little bit of falling action, and then a resolution where your lesson or your theme is made crystal clear. But again, remember, keep it simple. So I'm going to ask for you right now, by the end of the period, your goal is to have your narrative planned out. Think about what is the conflict that you can draw from the source materials. What's the setting? What imagery or details or descriptions can you include? How can you really rely on those source materials as you're planning and writing your narrative? Get started.